She was 65 years old, and for the first time in her life, homeless. Her two grown sons, men she had nursed through fevers and taught to read, had sold her home from under her to settle their mining debts. She was left with nothing but the clothes she wore, a small trunk of sewing notions, and the deed to a collapsing trapper's cabin high in the San Juan Mountains, a place no one had wanted for 40 years. But what her sons and the world didn't know was that beneath the rotted floorboards of that forgotten cabin lay a secret kept by her father. A secret that would not only give her shelter, but would rewrite the ownership of the entire valley. This is the story of Margaret Doyle, and how the quiet skills of a lifetime allowed her to reclaim a world that had cast her out. Margaret was born in the spring of 1822, not in the sharp-edged mountains of Colorado, but in the rolling green hills of County Clare, Ireland. She was Margaret O'Connell then, the only child of Liam and Ioife O'Connell. Her father was a man of the land, but not a farmer. He was a trapper and a hunter, a man who knew the language of the wind and the habits of the fox. Her mother was a woman of quiet strength, with hands that were never still, always spinning wool or tending the small garden that fed them. Their life was spare but not poor, held together by the strong threads of work and affection. But the world was changing, and the potato blight that would later starve the nation was already casting long, hungry shadows. When Margaret was 5, Oife succumbed to a fever that swept through the village, leaving a void in their small cottage that felt as vast and cold as the Atlantic. Liam, his heart fractured but his will intact, looked at his small daughter and knew he could not let her be consumed by the same hardships that had taken her mother. He sold his few possessions, packed a single sea chest with his traps, a rifle, and his wife's silver locket, and took Margaret's hand, walking them to the port at Cove. They were bound for America. The journey was a blur of salt spray and sickness, but Liam's presence was a constant, solid warmth. He held her on the crowded deck and pointed to the endless horizon, not with promises of gold, but of space, of air, of a place where a man's skill could still earn him a life. They landed in New York, a city of bewildering noise and speed, and worked their way west over years, Liam taking whatever work he could find, clearing land, building railroads, scouting for wagon trains. Through it all, he was her teacher. He taught her to read not from a proper schoolbook, but from the Bible and tattered copies of Shakespeare he traded for pelts. He taught her to patch her own clothes with a neat, strong stitch, to identify edible plants, to read the weather in the clouds, and to be silent in the woods. He taught her that competence was a form of grace, and that self-reliance was the only true wealth. When she was 12, he carved her a small bird from a piece of pine, a tiny, perfect wren, its head cocked as if listening. It was the only toy she ever had, and she kept it always. They finally settled in the raw, new territory of Colorado, in the high, formidable San Juan Mountains, where the beaver were still plentiful. Liam built a one-room cabin with his own hands, felling the lodgepole pines and setting the river stones for the foundation and chimney. It was there, in that small, sturdy shelter, that Margaret spent her girlhood, learning the rhythms of the seasons and the deep, abiding solitude of the high country. She loved her father with a fierce, quiet devotion. He was a man of few words, but his love was in every lesson, in the way he made sure her boots were dry, in the extra blanket he laid over her on cold nights. At 19, she met Thomas Doyle, a prospector who had come to the mountains not for pelts, but for silver. He was a kind man, with a gentle smile and a dreamer's heart, a stark contrast to her practical, earth-bound father. Liam did not disapprove, but he watched with a cautious eye. "He looks at the rock, Maggie," he told her once, his voice soft. "He's looking for what's in it. Never forget to look at the rock itself." She married Thomas, and they moved down from the high trapping grounds to the fledgling town of Silver Creek, which was just beginning to spring up in the lower valley. Thomas built them a small, respectable house, and Margaret made it a home. She planted a garden, and her skills with a needle, once used for mending canvas and buckskin, were now turned to finer things. She became the town's seamstress, her stitches as reliable as the sunrise. She made wedding dresses and burial shrouds, patched miners' trousers, and altered the Sunday suits of the town's merchants. Her work was her anchor, a source of pride and steady, if modest, income. She and Thomas had 2 sons, James and Michael. She loved them dearly, but as they grew, she saw in them their father's dreamer heart without his gentleness, and none of her father's practicality. They were drawn to the promise of quick riches, the allure of the silver mines that pulsed with a feverish energy all around them. Thomas died of pneumonia in the winter of '79, leaving Margaret a widow at 57. Her sons, by then grown men, were supposed to be her support. Instead, they became her burden, their mining ventures always on the verge of a great strike that never came, their debts mounting like tailings from a played-out claim. She continued her sewing, her small earnings often diverted to their latest investment. She did it without complaint, because they were her sons, and the memory of the small boys she had raised was still a powerful force. Through all the years in town, she kept the small pine wren her father had carved, a tangible link to the quiet competence and unconditional love that had shaped her. It sat on her sewing table, a silent witness to a life of patient, diligent work, a life she believed was secure within the 4 walls of her home. The end of her life in Silver Creek came not with a shout, but with the quiet click of her own front gate. It was a Tuesday in late October of 1887. The last of the asters in her garden had succumbed to the frost, and the air had the sharp, clean bite of impending snow. She was finishing a christening gown for the banker's new grandchild, the delicate lace a whisper under her skilled fingers, when she saw her sons, James and Michael, walking up the path. They did not walk with their usual swagger. Their shoulders were slumped, their faces pale and set. She put down her needle, a familiar knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. They did not come inside. They stood on the porch, twisting their hats in their hands, avoiding her eyes. James, the elder, was the one who spoke. "Ma," he began, his voice rough. "There's been some trouble. With the assay office, a misunderstanding about our claim." Margaret waited, her hands resting in her lap. She had heard versions of this speech before, but this time was different. Michael shifted his weight, his gaze fixed on a loose board by his feet. "The long and short of it is, we owed a great deal. To Mr. Blackwood, Silas Blackwood." The name settled in the air like dust. He was a speculator from Denver, a man who bought up debts and claims, a man whose wealth was built on the failures of others. "He was good enough to settle it for us," James continued, the words coming in a rush. "He took the debt in exchange for the property." Margaret looked past him, at the neat clapboard house, the porch Thomas had built, the windows she had washed every spring for 40 years. "This property," she said. It was not a question. "Ma, we had no choice," Michael mumbled. "It was this or the county jail." A man appeared behind them, stepping out from the shadow of the large cottonwood by the street. Silas Blackwood. He was dressed in a fine wool suit, his face smooth and unreadable. He held a sheaf of papers in his hand. "Mrs. Doyle," he said, his voice polite but devoid of warmth, "your sons have made a difficult but necessary decision. The deed has been signed over. I am the new owner." Margaret felt a strange calm settle over her. There was no room for tears, no space for anger. The situation was as solid and immovable as a wall of granite. She looked at her sons, at their averted faces, their weak chins, and she saw them for what they were. Not malicious, but careless, and that was a cruelty all its own. "We didn't leave you with nothing, Ma," James said, finally meeting her gaze. He held out a folded piece of paper. "This is the deed to Grandpa Liam's old place, the trapper's cabin. It's still in the family name. You'll have a roof over your head." A roof that hadn't been sound in 4 decades. A place miles from anyone, with winter coming on. It was a gesture of monumental, thoughtless cruelty, presented as a kindness. She did not take the paper. "Leave it on the railing," she said, her voice even. She stood up and went back inside, closing the door behind her. She did not watch them go. She moved through the house with a deliberate, unhurried grace. She packed one small trunk. In it, she placed her sewing kit, needles, thread, beeswax, her best shears. She packed the christening gown, which she would finish. She packed her late husband's silver watch and the small pine wren her father had carved for her. She put on her heaviest wool cloak and her sturdiest boots. When she walked out of the house an hour later, the deed was sitting on the porch railing, weighted down by a rock. Her sons were gone. Silas Blackwood was standing by the gate watching her. She walked past him without a word, her back straight, carrying the trunk that held the entirety of her 65 years. She did not look back. She walked down the dusty main street of Silver Creek and headed east, toward the rising slopes of the San Juan Mountains. The journey upward was a slow, arduous pilgrimage from one life to another. Margaret walked the 3 miles to the livery stable at the edge of town, her small trunk growing heavier with every step. The stable owner, a man named Henderson, whose children's clothes she had mended for a decade, watched her approach with a pained look on his face. News in a town like Silver Creek traveled faster than a grass fire. He offered his condolences with his eyes, not his words, and for that she was grateful. "I need to get up to the old O'Connell trapping grounds," she said, her voice steady. "As far as a wagon can go." He nodded, hooking up a stout mule to a small buckboard. "That'll be the base of Sentinel Peak. The trail gets rough after that. You sure about this, Margaret? Winter's closing in." She simply met his gaze, and he asked no more questions. He loaded her trunk and helped her up onto the seat, refusing her offer of payment. The buckboard lurched into motion, leaving the last vestiges of Silver Creek behind. The road climbed relentlessly, winding through vast stands of aspen, their leaves a shivering golden currency scattered on the ground. The air grew thinner, sharper. The scent of dust and town life gave way to the clean, resinous perfume of pine and the damp, earthy smell of the high country. Margaret sat straight, her hands folded in her lap, observing the transition with a familiar calm. This was her father's world. She had not been this high in the mountains for over 40 years, but her body remembered it. She felt the pull of the altitude in her lungs, the way the sunlight, filtered through the high, thin atmosphere, seemed both brighter and colder. They passed abandoned mining claims, the skeletal remains of sluice boxes and headframes stark against the blue sky, monuments to the very ambition that had cost her a home. She felt no bitterness, only a distant, quiet pity for the men who spent their lives chasing whispers of color in the rock, blind to the wealth of the forest, the water, and the sky around them. After several hours, Henderson pulled the mule to a halt. "This is it," he said, gesturing to a narrow, overgrown track that disappeared into a thick stand of spruce. "Trail starts here. It's another 2 miles, maybe 3, to where I reckon your father's cabin is, by the fork in the creek." He unloaded her trunk, his movements slow and deliberate. "I can't leave you here, Margaret. It ain't right." "You have a family to get back to, Mr. Henderson," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She reached into her reticule and pressed a few coins into his hand for his trouble. "Thank you for the ride." He stood for a long moment, his face a mask of worry. Then he finally climbed back onto the buckboard and turned the mule around. She watched until the wagon was out of sight, its rattling fading into the vast silence of the mountains. Then she turned to face the trail. She was 65 years old. The trunk was heavy, filled with the tools of her trade and the talismans of her heart. She hoisted it, her muscles protesting, and began to walk. The trail was barely visible, littered with fallen branches and loose rocks. It climbed steeply, and soon she was breathing hard, her heart pounding a heavy rhythm against her ribs. She moved slowly, with the patient, energy-conserving gait her father had taught her. One step, then another. She did not think about the cold, or her age, or the injustice that had brought her here. She focused on the world around her. She noted the fresh tracks of a deer, the scolding chatter of a squirrel, the way the moss grew thickest on the north side of the trees. These were the things that were real. This was the language she still understood. The sun began to dip behind the western peaks, casting long purple shadows across the landscape. The temperature dropped sharply. Finally, through the trees, she heard it, the sound of moving water. She pushed through a final curtain of spruce branches and found herself on the bank of a rushing creek. And there, nestled in a small clearing on the other side, was the cabin. It was smaller than she remembered and more dilapidated. From across the creek, it looked less like a dwelling and more like a part of the landscape that was slowly surrendering to the forces of gravity and time. The roof, once tightly packed with sod and pine shingles, now sagged in the middle like the back of an old horse. The stone chimney her father had built with such care was leaning at a precarious angle, a dark gap showing where several stones had fallen away. The single window was a dark, vacant eye, its glass long gone. A thicket of wild raspberries grew against the south wall, their thorny canes reaching up as if to pull the logs apart. Margaret found a place where the creek ran shallow over a bed of smooth stones and waded across. The icy water a shocking jolt that went straight to her bones. She set her trunk down on the damp ground and approached the cabin slowly, her heart a strange mix of sorrow and homecoming. The log walls, hewn from massive lodgepole pines, were still sound for the most part, the timber seasoned by 40 winters. But the chinking, the mix of mud, moss, and grass her father had packed between the logs to keep out the wind, had crumbled away in many places, leaving gaps through which the fading daylight shone. The door, made of thick, adzed planks, hung crookedly on one leather hinge. She pushed it open. It scraped against the floor with a protesting groan. The inside was a single room, perhaps 12 feet by 16. It smelled of damp earth, mildew, and the faint, lingering scent of wood smoke, a ghost of the fires that had warmed it long ago. A thick layer of dust, leaves, and mouse droppings covered everything. A simple wooden bunk was built into one wall, its ropes rotted away. In the center of the room stood a rusted, three-legged stove, its pipe disconnected and lying on the floor. The floor itself was made of puncheons, logs split in half and laid flat side up, but many were warped and soft with rot. It was a ruin. It was a place of profound decay. But as Margaret stood there, in the deepening twilight, she did not see only the ruin. She saw the good bones of the place. She saw the solid foundation stones that had not shifted an inch. She saw the massive ridgepole, straight and true, that still supported the sagging roof. She saw the careful, precise joinery in the corners, where her father had notched the logs together, a testament to his skill and patience. He had built this place to last, and it had. It had waited for her. She ran her hand over the cool, rough surface of the hewn logs. This was not a house sold out from under her. This was not a speculator's asset. This was a legacy. It was broken and neglected, but it was hers. She swept a space clear on the floor with the edge of her boot, set down her trunk, and sat upon it as darkness filled the small, broken cabin. She was cold, she was tired, and she was utterly alone. But for the first time since her sons had appeared on her porch, she felt the first faint stirring of something that was not despair. It was the feeling of work to be done. The first snows came a week later, not as a gentle dusting, but as a heavy, wet blanket that clung to the pines and silenced the world. Margaret had spent that week in a fever of activity, driven by the urgency of the approaching winter. She had used her shears to cut tall grasses and her bare hands to dig clay from the creek bank, mixing it with water to create a crude but effective chinking to seal the worst of the gaps in the log walls. She had scavenged fallen branches for firewood, stacking them inside to dry. She had found the fallen stones from the chimney, and with grunting effort, managed to wrestle them back into place, securing them with more of the clay mortar. It was not a mason's work, but it would hold. The most pressing problem was the floor. It was a sieve for the cold, the damp earth beneath breathing a constant chill into the small space. The puncheons near the door and under the window were soft as sponge, and the drafts that whistled up between them were relentless. On a particularly cold afternoon, with the wind howling outside, she decided she could bear it no longer. She had to fix the floor, or she would not survive the winter. Using the small hatchet her father had left behind, its head rusted, but its edge still true after she sharpened it on a river stone, she began to pry up the most rotted of the floorboards. The wood splintered and broke apart in her hands. As she pulled up a long, warped section near the hearth, she saw that the packed earth beneath was not uniform. There was a distinct rectangular outline, a section of ground that was slightly more compressed than the area around it. Her curiosity piqued. She cleared away the debris and began to dig at the outline with the hatchet head. The ground was hard, but after a few inches, the hatchet struck something solid with a dull thud. It was wood. Carefully, she scraped away the dirt, revealing the top of a small, dark-colored chest. It was made of cedar, bound with iron straps, and it was unexpectedly heavy. With her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm, she worked her fingers under the edge and lifted. The chest was about 2 feet long and a foot wide, its surface cool and slightly damp. There was no lock, only a simple iron hasp. She lifted the hasp, her breath held tight in her chest, and raised the lid. The air filled with the sharp, clean scent of cedar and old leather. The chest was packed with beaver pelts, cured and bundled with twine. They were of the highest quality, their fur thick and dark and glossy even after decades in the earth. But as she lifted the first bundle, she realized there was something inside it. Wrapped carefully within the soft fur were small, heavy pouches made of deer hide, each tied shut with a leather thong. She loosened the knot on the first pouch and poured a small amount of its contents into her palm. It was gold dust, a fine, glittering powder that caught the dim light from the open door. She opened another pouch, and another. They were all the same. There were at least a dozen pouches, a small fortune in raw gold, skimmed and saved over a lifetime of trapping. Beneath the last of the pelts, at the very bottom of the chest, lay a flat, oilskin-wrapped package. Her hands trembled slightly as she untied the string. Inside was a letter, the paper yellowed but the ink still dark and clear. It was her father's handwriting, the strong, deliberate script she knew so well. It began, "For my Maggie." She carried the letter to the door, where the light was best, and began to read. "My dearest daughter," it said, "if you are reading this, then the world has not been as kind to you as I had hoped, and you have had cause to come back to this place. I am sorry for that. I saved this gold from my trapping years, a little skimmed from each trade with the fur companies. They never paid a fair price, so I considered this my own wage. It is not a king's ransom, but I hope it is enough to give you a new start. Use it to build a good life, a life of your own making. That is all I ever wanted for you." Her eyes blurred with tears, the first she had shed since leaving Silver Creek. She wiped them away with the back of her hand and continued reading. But the gold is not the real inheritance, Maggie. The real value is not in what can be dug from the ground, but in the ground itself. I have left you a map. It is on the back of this letter. It leads to a place not far from here, a place I found when I first scouted this valley. There you will find something of greater worth than all the silver in these mountains. This cabin, this land, it was always meant for you. For my Maggie, or for whoever finds this and has need of it. May it build you a good life. Your loving father, Liam O'Connell. She turned the letter over. Burned onto the back of the thick paper was a map, a simple but clear drawing of the creek, the surrounding peaks, and a single, large ponderosa pine, marked with an X. It was on the ridge overlooking the valley, the same valley where the town of Silver Creek now lay. A wave of emotion washed over her. Grief for the father she had lost so long ago, gratitude for his foresight, and a fierce, burning love for the man who had loved her so completely. He had seen the possibility of her hardship and had prepared a way for her, a final act of paternal care reaching across 40 years. The gold was a tool, a means to an end. The map was a promise. She carefully refolded the letter and the map, placing them in the inner pocket of her dress. The gold dust gave her a weapon against the coming winter. The map gave her a purpose that extended beyond mere survival. She looked around the broken cabin, no longer seeing just the decay, but seeing the foundation of her future. Her father had given her the means. Now, it was up to her to do the building. The next morning, Margaret woke with a new resolve. She ate a small meal of dried berries and jerky, then secured the cabin as best she could and set out, the deerskin map tucked safely inside her cloak. The air was frigid, and the sky was the color of lead, threatening more snow. But she moved with a purpose that ignored the cold. The map was clear, her father's markings precise. She followed the creek upstream, then began the steep ascent up the eastern ridge, the same one she had looked at from her garden for 40 years. The climb was strenuous, but her body was hardening to the mountain, her lungs adjusting to the thin air. After 2 hours of steady climbing, she reached the crest of the ridge and saw it. A massive, ancient ponderosa pine, its bark scarred by lightning, standing alone against the sky. It was exactly as her father had drawn it. Following the map's final instruction, she walked 20 paces due west from the tree's base and began to search the ground. She found it almost immediately, a small, unnatural-looking pile of flat stones, a cairn so weathered and covered in lichen that it seemed a part of the landscape. With numb fingers, she began to pull the stones away. Beneath them was a flat rock, and under that, a cavity dug into the earth. Inside the cavity was a small tin box, its seams sealed with wax. She carried the box back to the cabin, her mind racing. What could be more valuable than gold? Jewels? More deeds? She pried the lid open with the tip of her knife. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were not jewels, but documents. Several large folded parchments, heavy with the weight of official seals. She spread the first one out on the floor. It was a United States land patent, dated 1858. It granted title of a specific parcel of land, described in the meticulous language of surveyors, to one Liam O'Connell, in recognition of his service as a scout and guide for the U.S. Army. She unfolded the next one, and the next. There were 4 of them in total. Together, they granted her father sole and absolute ownership of the entire valley, the very land on which the town of Silver Creek was built, the land where her son's worthless mining claim was located, the land her old house stood upon. She sat back on her heels, the enormity of it settling upon her. Her father had never registered the patents with the territorial government. He had held them, a quiet, secret claim to the place he had been the first to map. The town, the mines, the ranches, They were all, legally, squatting on her land. The sale her sons had made to Silas Blackwood was void. They had sold something they had never owned. Her father's words echoed in her mind. The real value is not in what can be dug from the ground, but in the ground itself. He had understood. He had secured the one thing that truly mattered. This knowledge changed everything. It was no longer just about surviving the winter. It was about reclaiming her life. But first, the cabin. With a small portion of the gold dust, she walked the miles back down to the edge of town and found a freighter willing to haul supplies. She did not go into Silver Creek itself. She bought glass for the window, a new stovepipe, sacks of flour and beans, and most importantly, a proper saw, a hammer, and nails. The work of rebuilding began in earnest. An old Ute hunter named Many Horses, who had known her father, appeared one day at her door. He looked at her work on the chimney and said simply, "My friend Liam built better than that." He spent the next week with her, showing her how to mix the clay with pine pitch to make it waterproof, how to properly re-chink the logs so they were sealed tight against the wind. He asked for nothing in return. Another man, a prospector named Elias Thorne, whose claims had all played out, stumbled upon her cabin while hunting. He was gaunt and discouraged, but he knew how to work stone. In exchange for a share of her food, he spent 2 weeks rebuilding the chimney, making it straight and solid, its draw perfect. Margaret, in turn, felled dead, dry pines with her new saw, cutting them into lengths to replace the rotted puncheons, her muscles aching but growing stronger with each day's labor. Slowly, methodically, the cabin was transformed. The window held clear glass, the floor was solid underfoot, and the new stove radiated a steady, glorious warmth. The work was hard, a constant battle against the encroaching cold, but it was honest. Every nail hammered, every log sealed, was an act of creation, a defiant statement against the forces that had sought to unmake her. As the deep winter snows buried the mountains, Margaret's cabin became a small bastion of warmth and light. The structure was now sound, the larder was stocked, and the steady work of survival settled into a manageable rhythm. She spent the long, dark evenings by the light of a tallow lamp, mending her worn clothes and methodically planning her next move. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a landowner with a duty to her inheritance. In late March, when the first signs of the thaw began, she packed a small satchel with the tin box of patents and a pouch of gold dust. She left the cabin in the care of Elias Thorne, who had become a quiet and respectful fixture, his presence a comfort against the immense solitude. Dressed in her warmest cloak, she made the long journey back down to Silver Creek. The town looked different to her now. She saw not a community that had rejected her, but a collection of buildings and lives situated on land that belonged to her. She walked with a quiet confidence that drew curious stares. She did not go to her old house. She went directly to the county courthouse, a small clapboard building that smelled of stale paper and chewing tobacco. The county clerk was a young man named Peterson, overwhelmed and harried. She waited patiently until he was free. Then she stepped forward. "I would like to file these, please," she said, placing the tin box on the counter. She opened it and laid out the 4 land patents, their seals still intact. Peterson picked one up, his brow furrowed in confusion. He read the legal description, then looked at a large map of the county pinned to the wall. His eyes widened. He read another, and then a third, his face growing paler with each one. "Mrs. Doyle, this can't be right," he stammered. "These patents, they cover the entire valley, the whole town. They were granted to my father, Liam O'Connell, in 1858, Margaret said calmly. "I am his only heir." The news spread through Silver Creek like a flood. It was the only topic of conversation in the saloons, the general store, the parlors. Silas Blackwood, upon hearing the news, was the first to act. He hired a lawyer from Denver and filed a challenge, claiming adverse possession and fraud. He confronted Margaret on the street, his usual composure gone, his face mottled with rage. "You think you can just show up with some dusty old papers and steal this town?" he snarled. Margaret met his furious gaze without flinching. "I am not stealing anything, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, her voice even. "I am claiming what is mine. You, on the other hand, purchased a property from two men who had no legal right to sell it. That seems to me to be the definition of a fraudulent transaction." The legal battle was swift. The federal patents were undeniable. Blackwood's claim of adverse possession failed, as the land had never been officially registered or taxed. Within 2 months, the territorial court affirmed Margaret Doyle as the legal owner of the O'Connell Valley. Her sons, James and Michael, disappeared, having fled their debts and their shame. Margaret did not enact a vengeful eviction. That was not her way. She had the town surveyed, and she sent letters to every property owner, including Silas Blackwood, who now occupied her former home. She offered them all the opportunity to lease the land on which their homes and businesses stood for a modest but fair annual fee. Most, relieved to have their lives secured, agreed immediately. She was no longer just Margaret the seamstress, she was Mrs. Doyle, the proprietor of the valley. She did not move back to her old house. Her home was the cabin her father had built. She returned to the high country, to the quiet and the clean air. Her life settled into a new pattern. Elias Thorne stayed on, acting as a caretaker and handyman, his quiet companionship a welcome presence. Many horses visited often, bringing herbs and news from the high peaks. People from the town would occasionally make the journey up to see her, bringing a jar of preserves or a new book, and she would mend a shirt or offer them a cup of tea by her warm stove. The cabin, once a symbol of her destitution, was now a place of quiet power, the heart of the valley she now stewarded. It was a living place, filled with the purpose of a woman who had been underestimated, a woman who had found her strength not in rage, but in the patient, diligent work of her own 2 hands. Deep winter returned to the San Juan Mountains, burying the valley under a thick, silent blanket of snow. Inside the small cabin, a steady column of smoke rose from the stone chimney, a signal of warmth and life against the vast, white expanse. Margaret sat in a simple chair by the stove, the steady heat a comfort against her old bones. The room was tidy and functional, every object having its purpose. On a small table beside her, her sewing kit lay open, a testament to the craft that had sustained her. Next to it sat her late husband's silver watch, its ticking a quiet, constant memory of a gentle love. In her hand, she cradled the small pine wren her father had carved for her so long ago. Its wood was worn smooth from a lifetime of touch, a tangible link to the man whose foresight had saved her. She ran her thumb over its tiny carved wing, thinking of him. She pictured him in this very room, a young man with a will of iron, carefully notching the great logs, his mind already looking past the immediate need for shelter to the long, uncertain future of the daughter he adored. He had seen the true nature of wealth, not in the fleeting glitter of silver, but in the enduring value of the land itself. He had left her not just a place, but a legacy of self-reliance, a belief in the power of competence. She thought of her sons, James and Michael. The anger she might have once felt had long since dissolved into a kind of weary sorrow. They were like their father, Thomas, in their dreaming, but they lacked his fundamental kindness. They had been blinded by the promise of easy riches, a fever that had caused them to discard what was most precious. She hoped, wherever they were, that they might one day understand the difference between price and value. The cabin was her fortress and her sanctuary. Every solid floorboard, every sealed chink, every pane of clear glass was a part of her story. She had not been given this home. She had earned it, board by board, stone by stone. She had taken the ruin she was handed, and with the skills taught to her in childhood, she had rebuilt it, and in doing so, had rebuilt herself. The community she had found was not one of church socials and polite conversation, but one forged in shared labor and mutual respect. Elias Thorne, now her steadfast friend, kept the woodpile high. Many horses provided knowledge of the mountains that no map could contain. The people in the valley below sent their lease payments, and with them often small gifts of gratitude, acknowledgments of the quiet, unexpected grace she had shown them. She was 66 years old now. She had been cast out, left with what was considered nothing. She had faced the wilderness and the winter alone, and she had not only survived, she had prevailed. She had taken a worthless deed to a rotting cabin and uncovered an inheritance that had made her the master of her own fate. Margaret Doyle was 66 years old, and she was home. She had a few pouches of gold dust and a set of old patents to her name, and with them she had bought back her life. It was the best inheritance she had ever received. The story of Margaret Doyle reminds us that what appears to be an ending can often be a new beginning in disguise. The things we inherit, both the tangible and the intangible, can hold a power we may not recognize at first. Have you ever discovered unexpected value in something that others had overlooked or cast aside? Share your stories of finding treasure in unexpected places, and if you believe in the power of quiet resilience, please share this story with others who might need to hear it.